my name is Michael West, and today we're going to be discussing some of the frontiers in aging research with a distinguished panel of aging researchers. Left on the panel, besides me, is Dr. Aubrey de Grey. Aubrey, why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure, thank you, Mike. So I am a biomedical gerontologist. I've been working in this space for about 20 years, and my primary role is that I'm the Chief Science Officer at SENS Research Foundation, a 501c3 non-profit charity based in Silicon Valley. We do very early stage translational research, figuring out how to repair the various types of molecular and cellular damage that the body does to itself that eventually make us sick when we get old, and thereby rejuvenate the body. Our business model effectively is that we take projects along to a point of sufficient proof of concept that they can be spun out into startup companies. And as my second job, I work part-time for you, Mike, of course, at AgeX Therapeutics in the capacity of VP of New Technology Discovery. And it's a great privilege to be able to do that, working on an area of rejuvenation biotechnology that we have not tended to emphasize terribly strongly at SENS Research Foundation, largely because of your efforts over the years in pioneering this in the private sector. Other than that, I spend a lot of my time doing things like this, doing public speaking and advocacy to hasten the defeat of this scourge.
Thank you, Aubrey. Also with us is Dr. Lynne Cox. Lynne, how about a little bit of a background on yourself and your interests?
Hi, Mike. Lovely to see everybody again. I'm a biogerontologist at the University of Oxford. I've been there for well over 20 years, nearly 25 coming up, looking at the molecular basis of aging, particularly in humans, but we use model organisms. We look in flies, we look in worms. And for a long time, we've studied premature aging and the genetic components that predispose to early aging. But we've now taken a different approach, complementary approach as well. We're looking at normal cellular aging, the process of cell senescence, doing some biochemical analysis of that, looking at the pathways involved. And I've got a particular interest in mTOR, a signaling hub that we might come on to a bit later, because I know it is right up Marc Street. So we're looking at ways in which we can not only understand the biology of aging, but do something about it, intervene in it to improve health outcomes in later life.
Thank you. And Marc, how about a little bit of background on yourself as well?
Yes, first, thank you everyone for sharing this panel. For me, it's an honor because I am new in this field. Actually, I started to learn about aging about 2 years and a half ago when I co-founded a company with Professor Manuel Serrano called Senolytic Therapeutics, where I am still the CEO of the company. We develop drugs that target senescent cells. We're based in Barcelona and also in Boston, and I live in Basel, so the triple B here. And by background, I've been working on biotech for the last 13 years since my professor at your institution, Lynne Cox, he started the company, and I've been always fascinated on being part of startup companies at the first 2-3 years. So thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you for joining us. So you see my background here. Behind me, virtually behind me, is a picture from Dr. Leonard Hayflick. Back in the 1960s, he was the first to discover that human cells, when grown in the laboratory dish, actually age. And, you know, everyone, all of us needed a model system to study aging, or maybe multiple ones, you know, mice and humans and so on. And I chose the cell aging model, and I put it behind us because I don't think I've ever been on a panel with so many people interested in cell aging. I mean, all of you guys are interested in it. Another little background for our viewers. You know, whenever I think of us talking about aging research, and we have viewers that come from various backgrounds, maybe they're interested in aging, maybe they're, you know, interested in investing in companies and so on. I feel like I'm like in the Grand Canyon or something, on one side of a canyon with people on the other side, realizing there's a big gulf of understanding of what we do and what we know about aging on a cellular and molecular level, and what the average layperson knows and understands. What we're going to be talking about today has a presupposition. The presupposition is that we actually know enough about aging, and we believe that it's a, what would you say, a clockwork mechanism, that we could actually devise therapeutics to intervene in it. And biotech companies or biotech efforts, pharmaceutical efforts, is really where the rubber meets the road, isn't it? It's where we say we know enough about aging that we could actually devise therapeutics that could intervene in it and that would be safe and efficacious and make an impact on aging itself. I feel like a lot of the lay public really doesn't understand where we are today and some of the history of that. Maybe I could ask each of you to give your insight in how did we get to where we are today, and then where are we today in our understanding and intervening in aging? Why don't we go left to right? Aubrey, what are your thoughts?
Well, yeah, it's been a long journey, and I guess we've still got some way to go. But it's curious how the progress in the laboratory and among specialists has contrasted with progress that we've seen in the wider world in terms of understanding. I think you're absolutely right in what you said, that the understanding on the part of the general public and, of course, decision makers and policy makers has considerably lagged behind what's going on among the expert community. But of course, that's normal. That's, you know, that's every field has an expert community. So I don't think that's really the main point. I think the main point is that with this particular field, we are working within the context of a very unusual psychological position that humanity is in. Namely that we've had to, you know, find some way to get on with our miserably short lives and make the best of them, despite the fact that this terrible thing is coming that we can't do anything about. So we've constructed all of these psychological tricks to kind of put aging out of our minds, and those tricks result in extremely curious responses and reactions to news about progress in the work that people on this panel do. I certainly come across this all the time. And I think what we've seen over the past, if we just look at the past 10 years or 15 years since I've been a prominent figure in this field, you know, there's been a sea change of enormous proportions in some ways with regard to how seriously people take the prospect of bringing aging under significant or even comprehensive medical control. People now do not regard that as science fiction. They don't tend to regard it as something that shouldn't be talked about in polite society. It's considered to be something that's a perfectly reasonable topic of conversation. But still, there is a huge way to go to get people to take it as seriously as they take Alzheimer's disease, for example. There's still an absolute compulsion among most people to think of the so-called diseases of aging as somehow completely different in some kind of qualitative way from this rather poorly defined thing called aging itself.
Yeah, I'm looking at it, the layperson, I would say exactly that. I would say, aren't you talking about diseases? We all know Alzheimer's is a disease. Yeah, and maybe we can devise a drug, although we so far haven't been doing a great job, have we? Making a drug for Alzheimer's disease. But let's say we had one. Well, that's a disease. But aging, well, aging isn't a disease. It's a normal part of life. That's what the average person would say, right? How would you counter that?
Well, right. And of course, what I say is that the right way to think about this is to look at what we actually know of the biology and to ask ourselves simple, obvious questions like, you know, how can a disease be age-related? How can it be that such and such a disease predominantly affects people who are born a long time ago? The only way that that can be true, logically, is if it's actually part of aging, and therefore it should not be considered to be anything like an infection. And, you know, hammer this home every time I get on stage or on camera, and gradually more and more people begin to understand it. But it is quite frustrating how difficult it is to get people to, to step away from the completely unscientific way of thinking of this distinction that they've been brought up to believe.
Lynne, what's your perspective? You've been, how many years now you've been in the aging research field?
About, well over 20. Let's
That's been a long time. Yeah. So
I do a fair bit of public outreach on this stuff, and it's very interesting when you go in and ask people their attitudes towards treating disease and health, and then their attitudes towards treating aging. And there is a huge dichotomy between the approaches that we'd like to adopt. So the way I deal with it is go in and tell them about the basic biology. So Mike, you're sitting in front of a pile of senescent cells. Now, you could equally well be sitting in front of a pile of cancer cells. Cancer is a disease caused by the body's own cells going wrong. And nobody, well, I've never met anybody who has a psychological problem with treating cancer. Treating the cells that go wrong from the body, right? Okay, that's just a moral thing that we do. We treat people who've got something wrong with them. Now, if you look at aging, until relatively recently, although we knew that we had senescent cells, we didn't know they were causative in aging. So it's only within the past decade that we've had enough scientific data to say, yeah, these things are actually causing harm. And if you get rid of them, you might be doing some good. So when you rephrase the argument with the general public and say, okay, if you've got cancer cells, they're the body's perfectly normal, natural cells, but they've just gone wrong, you get rid of them. If you've got aging cells, they're the body's perfectly normal, natural cells, they've just gone a bit wrong. It's exactly the same process to get rid of those. And then you can overcome that psychological hurdle that you're playing God, that it's wrong to intervene. It's simply a ball of cells that are doing dodgy stuff to you. So when I phrase it like that, and we sort of take polls of the audience before and after, it actually, you can overcome the hurdle to acceptance that this is something that maybe ought to be done and can be done.
I mean, cute little cells around me here are bad. They're zombie cells.
Right,
you call
so
them zombie cells,
I don't know if it's my internet hanging, or so I'll just carry on talking anyway, just in case. So we may have a bad internet connection.
Zombies are hard to kill, right? How do you kill them?
So my internet connection is unstable, so I apologize if things go a bit flaky. But the cells that you're sitting in front of are doing dangerous stuff when you've got too many of them. So they're kicking out things that inflame your body, that start breaking down the tissues. I mean, I've been in this field long enough to be noticing it happening, right? Marc, you're too young, but you get the wrinkles, and it's where these senescent cells are breaking down all the structures of your body. They're kicking out stuff that harms you. So we know that these things are harmful, and we know because of the biochemistry, the biology, all the studies that people have been doing in labs. So it's pretty clear cut now. And studies in mice, I mean, Marc, I'm probably stealing your thunder, sorry, but the studies in mice have shown that if you put senescent cells into young mice, they get old quickly. They get the diseases of aging, but multiple different diseases of aging. It's not just a single thing, aging across the board. And if you remove those senescent cells, the mice improve in health, and they also live longer as well. So there's a knock-on longevity benefit of being healthy. So we know that these things are bad for you. And in that context, I find it quite an easy sell.
So if these are zombie cells, Marc, can we kill the zombie cells?
Yes, we can. So first, let me comment some interesting point that I think Lynne also mentioned about. So I think that if we ask our grandparents about what is cancer, they will probably tell you that it's not a disease. They will probably say that people were getting old and they were dying, but they were not dying because there's a disease called cancer. So from my naive perspective, probably in a few generations, we may be asked to the people if what is aging, and they clearly, they will identify that as a disease. So now I think what we are between, no? That's my point. So for me, I will not try to explain scientific things as Lynne or Aubrey, because I think they are perfect for that. I will explain, trying to answer to your question, how we came here, okay? So take into account my case. I was about 2.5 years ago, I was sitting in my office and I received an email from a friend from the CNIO telling, oh, have you seen this publication from Manuel Serrano? He's developing a nanoparticles that target senescent cells. And the guy was sending that to me, not because of senescent cells, that because I co-founded 2 nanomedicine companies in the past. So I was thinking, why these senescent cells? Why he's targeting senescent cells? Then I discovered all this science that has been developed in the past 20 years that I didn't, sorry for my ignorance, but I didn't know even they was as solid, as good as it is now, okay? So now we are in a moment where we clearly can demonstrate that with xenomorphic or senolytic drugs, we are killing senescent cells in mice, and we can cure different diseases associated to age by the elimination of that senescent cells. But now we are in the challenge to transform this amazing science into clinical trials that some people is already doing that. And I think that's clearly where is the challenge now, how we transform this amazing science that has been developed in the past 20 years into medicines.
Well, yeah, let me just reemphasize one thing. I think that over the years, as I've talked to investors interested in the space, they all see the large market opportunity in aging. I mean, the aging baby boomers in the United States, over 75 million people, and they have somewhat 60% of the financial assets of the United States. And everyone sees that as an enormous market. But there's this tremendous skepticism. I think a lot of people watching this would say, isn't this hype? I mean, come on. Isn't aging wear and tear? Isn't it entropy? I mean, your car wears out, the human body wears out. Any thoughts? I have my own thoughts, but I want you guys to share yours on how would you respond to that natural skepticism that the public, policymakers, investors, and so on would have in the statement that there's a biology of aging that can be intervened in with drugs or other means like that? Any of you?
Yeah, I'll go first. I use the analogy with cars precisely to overcome that skepticism, because I point out that we have cars that are more than 100 years old and that are working every bit as well as they were when they were built. Those cars are relatively rare, of course, but that's simply because we are mostly lazy and we don't really care very much about our cars, and we only do the amount of maintenance on them that the law requires, and when that ends up being insufficient,
Are you talking about my car? Are you picking on? Yeah, they say the worst mechanic, or the worst taking care of cars are those of a mechanic, right? My family was in the auto business. Don't look at my car.
Now, of course, a car is a physical object that experiences the second law of thermodynamics, same as anything else does. But that's what preventative maintenance is all about. It's all about transferring that entropy from the machine to the rest of the world. In other words, essentially exporting entropy. And of course, the reason why living organisms live as long as they do is because they have enormously sophisticated machinery that allows them to export a lot of their entropy automatically without any medical intervention. So the only way that we need to think about the process of bringing aging under medical control is to augment that, to actually export or remove the entropy that the body is not exporting automatically on its own. And when put in that context, I find that people don't tend to have an answer. But actually, I think one important thing to emphasize here is that because these irrational feelings about the plausibility or even the desirability of dealing with aging are so deep-seated and have built up over so many millennia, even though we all have developed very strong and, you know, ironclad arguments that rebut this and that bring the idea of the medical control of aging to a realistic standpoint, and people hear these arguments and they seem to be convinced, the problem is that the following day they will kind of wake up and it'll all be a bad dream and they'll get on and think what they were thinking and do what they were doing anyway. So there seems to be a huge need for just, you know, relentless repeat advertising and to finally, you know, grind people's prejudices down on this.
Can I come in there?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I completely get the entropy argument. I was at an entrepreneurship thing and describing us as essentially we're bags of biology held to, fighting entropy by putting energy into the system. Now, I have a slight difference of opinion with Aubrey that I don't think you can probably carry on forever. I think that entropy will win in the end, because the whole point is that making the energy that fights against the entropy is actually going to cause damage along the way, and I'm not sure we have enough repair mechanisms that can overcome that. So the sheer process of being a lump of biology is actually going to drive you in the end into I can see Aubrey's eyes lighting up there, is potentially going to drive you to a point of no return, I think, at the moment anyway. And I am concerned about overhyping the issue and saying we have a solution that says we will never get old, we will never die. I think what we have at the moment, like the argument with cancer, is we're in the very first stages of drug development. The early cancer drugs were not very precise. They were really quite harsh therapies. And what we need to do is build the field so we've got something a lot more nuanced, a lot more personalized medicine. And then instead of doing the sort of hammer, we can do a gentle little tap during the maintenance. And I think then we stand a much better chance of doing it. But don't oversell, don't overpromise at the beginning, because if you're promising people that they will live forever, I think you're not going to get taken seriously. And I know that there's a lot of political angst against the story of super longevity, and we have to be very, very careful about the hype on this. I was a witness on a House of Lords Select Committee. It's something in the UK where parliamentarians get together and explore issues in quite a lot of detail. And they were very keen on the idea of health extension, absolutely not keen on the idea of lifespan extension beyond the point at which you have health. And what we can't promise at the moment is good health for an extremely long life. What we can do at the moment is suggest that we have therapies that can improve health for maybe 5, 6, 7, 8 years, and that will buy you extra life and life worth living. But I think we have to be very, very careful with selling this argument that we go slow, we go steady, and we win people over by showing that this stuff can work and can improve health, rather than promising the earth and then not delivering. So that's my take on we have to be careful with the hype.
I totally agree with that. I think we need to also to emphasize that this is a big deal. Okay, that's I think it's important to emphasize that. But at the same time, I think we need to manage the expectations. Okay, I think this is the case. Okay, so at least at our project, what we do is we know that we are developing a drug. Okay, we are developing a drug for renal fibrosis in our case. Okay, so that's what we are doing. Okay, and maybe because I am quite beginner in the field, I can do that easy because I don't get very into the aging because I am a beginner. Okay, so what I'm doing is we are developing a drug. Okay, but I have to say that we need to take the main point for us is we need to prove that the mechanism of action why this drug is working. It's obviously is a target therapy or whatever, but the reason is based on the biology of aging. That's for me really important. And the second point that is really important, and it's actually one of the challenge of the field, is to get the proper biomarkers on clinical trials in humans, because something is in mice, okay, and the challenge here is how we can demonstrate that in a human trial that for instance that the senescent cells are the reason why this drug is working, and the reason is not because just is a BCL-XL or an MDM2 inhibitor or whatever. It is the reason is the biomarker for senescence. and that's also that the senescent cells are not reaccumulating after the treatment, or all these type of things. So we need to emphasize on the management of the expectations at the same time that we are doing our job as a drug developers, bringing the molecule to the trials, and then in the human trials, be very solid with our plans and prove with the data that this, the moment that we prove with nice data that this is the reason, I think we will be in a very good position.
So I remember years ago, again, we're all grandchildren in a sense, I guess, of Leonard Hayflick, whose picture's behind me. Leonard Hayflick wrote a letter, I think it was to Science or Nature, one of the scientific journals, and they were talking about entropy in aging, and they said, after all, someone commented, after all, you can't unscramble an egg, right? So once you've scrambled it, you can't put it back together again. And Lynne, who's, by the way, for years has argued that aging is in part a reflection of entropy. He's been a real advocate of that idea. Nevertheless, pointed out, he says, you can unscramble an egg by feeding it to a hen. And, you know, you hear that comment, you think, oh, what does that mean? What is he really saying? I think there's a deep insight there, right? Don't you all agree that biology, I think, Lynne, you touched on it. Biology, in a sense, I mean, there's energy coming into the system. So the second law doesn't really apply to biological systems. But we're unscrambling eggs every day. I had scrambled eggs this morning, and my body's turning it into complex biomolecules that keep me alive, right? Isn't life inherently an anti-entropic, is that a word? Anti-entropic organism? We're derived from a lineage of cells that have been proliferating for billions of years. The germline that continue to make new humans that are born young. Isn't that?
Can I come in on your unscrambling an egg? Because I think Aubrey's probably going to make a point on this as well. There are potentially tricks by which you can change the state of a protein that has been denatured. So cells can do it, but also when we're talking about unscrambling an egg in the context of cell aging, you may not have to unscramble an entire cell. You may be able to get rid of the broken, worn out, damaged stuff. And one of the things that seems to be very beneficial in some of the drugs that we're looking at is pushing the cell to do its waste disposal properly, to do a process called autophagy or self-eating, where it just does a spring clean. It checks out all the muck, breaks it down into the building blocks, and makes new functional components out of the stuff that was worn out. So cells can unscramble their own eggs as well, if you like, by going through this process of autophagy. Now, I'm sure Aubrey is going to add to that it's not just cells. You can do it outside the body as well, Aubrey.
Well, that's true, yeah. But of course, there's much more that I want to say than that. I really want to come back to some of the very important points that you made, Lynne, earlier about hype and about how we can, what we should say and what we can say. If I look at my own history in this field, it's quite a lesson for this, because I started out, of course, saying things that were a bit more extreme than what most of my expert colleagues were saying. And one of the things that I had to be very careful of was to distance myself from what already existed back then as an anti-aging industry, consisting essentially of people making money out of things that didn't work. It was rather helpful that I look so aggressively unmaterialistic. And so people couldn't realistically presume that I was in this for personal financial gain. But then within the expert community, there was, of course, a great deal of concern about the kinds of things that I was saying on stage and on camera. And then something happened, which was that people started taking me very seriously at a point that was suspiciously coincidental with the point where I started bringing money into the field from sources that had never given money before. And those sources were, of course, people who were techies, people who had an engineering background, a mathematical background, people like Peter Thiel. Now, I think it's important for all of us as experts in the field to understand that the sources of money that are available to accelerate the work that we do are not all the same in terms of how they think. There is a huge diversity in terms of what people want to hear and what people don't want to hear. And I completely agree with Lynne that the people that we have to talk to who sit in the House of Lords, for example, are very scared of hearing anything about longevity. In fact, I believe that the field may have rather overdone their political correctness for a long time in the past by hyping the idea of compression of morbidity. In other words, the idea that we should be extending healthy lifespan without extending total lifespan even by the same amount. I think that probably was a misstep on our part. But with regard to the idea of radical increase in longevity, you know, the idea that I've given the name longevity escape velocity to. In other words, the idea that if we make modest advances in repairing the body, in rejuvenating the body to give us maybe a couple of decades of extra life, then thereafter we will stay one step ahead of the problem. This idea is, you know, considered to be totally crazy and unscientific by a lot of people. But what is often overlooked is that the techies who provide a lot of the money to this field now in an increasing amount are on the absolute opposite side. They regard people who regard longevity escape velocity as unscientific as like equivalent to climate deniers or, you know, flat earthers. They just think like it's completely unscientific to regard that as unscientific. And this is why I have ended up essentially taking a position of détente with other more prominent public people in this field. A great example is the relationship that I have with Eric Verdin, who runs the Buck Institute, because of course the Buck and SENS Research Foundation are the two most prominent non-profit entities in this field. And we have very similar views when it comes to the science. Of course we do, because we know a lot about this. But we have almost non-overlapping sets of donors. In other words, our audiences are completely different. And therefore, our policy is basically just to keep out of each other's rhetorical way. Even though we say very different things, we very much avoid criticizing each other.
So see if we can summarize where we are at the moment. So to use my Gulf or my Grand Canyon example, let me recount a little story, which maybe some of you can relate to. I was on an airplane some years ago, and you know how you sit next to somebody and they start, you know, what do you do, you know, type of thing. You're stuck with these people for several hours. And this fellow sitting next to me said, you know, what are you doing? I said, well, I work on aging. And he said, aging? Wow, what do we know about aging? You can't do anything about that, right? And I said, oh, yeah, you can. You know, we've learned a lot. So I took him through the Len Hayflick thing. And I told him the story about how years ago, some of us found this telomerase gene, and one gene immortalized the Len Hayflick cells. And I thought, you know, so, you know, wow, that was pretty cool. We all thought it was wear and tear and all that. And we found there was a gene that made cells immortal, you know. And then I took him through the Dolly thing about how scientists were really shocked that development, at least, you know, developmental aging was reversible by putting a cell like the ones behind me into an egg cell, and the egg cell acts like a time machine, you know, makes a baby lamb from an old cell. And anyway, so then, you know, the stewardess brings the sodas by or whatever, and he turns to me, he says, you're lying to me. And I said, why? Why do you say that? He says, I read everything. I read every newspaper. I just spend my whole day reading. I've never heard this. And if this was true, it would be the biggest breakthrough in the history of mankind. You're talking about human aging and mortality. This can't be true. It would be everywhere in the media. And when I heard that comment, I mean, obviously, any of our viewers can just, search any of the things we referred to on the internet and see this is mainstream gerontology we're talking about. This isn't fringe science. That's when I really began to recognize we have this huge gulf of understanding. So, but let's move on. So the challenge I sense, I want to see if you guys agree, is we've got this amazing knowledge now, not just us, but the field of gerontology researchers, into real biological mechanisms of aging. You can demonstrate that by tweaking the lifespan of model organisms and things, animals and things. Almost certainly, this is going to eventually become well-known and a subject of a lot of interest, right? We're talking about really a disease. If aging is a disease, it's a disease that's killing everyone, unlike cancer. So how do we navigate this field going forward, attracting legitimate attention to it, keeping the scientific rigor that we all want to see in the field, in the face of what's going to be inevitable, an inevitable hype industry, right? I saw this years ago in the stem cell field that I was involved with. All these hucksters out there started immediately marketing stem cell anti-aging skin cream and all kinds of things that had no scientific rationale whatsoever, but were simply trying to get into people's wallets. Love to hear your thoughts on how does the scientific community communicate the science in a responsible way, get policymakers interested in this, because if we could adequately fund the field, either through biotech investment or in funding of at university medical centers and so on, this field could, it reminds me of Aubrey with your escape velocity thing. We could actually build a rocket that could go to the moon, but it's going to take a significant amount of investment and commitment from industry and from policymakers. So how do we navigate those waters, and how do we land the man on the moon, Aubrey?
Well, I think we mustn't oversimplify this question, because really I believe that the hype question, or the distortion question, divides into two very different questions. There's one that revolves around what we can already do, and which revolves around the commercial side, people making money out of things that are unproven or that basically just don't work. But then in addition, there is the over-enthusiasm that many scientists are guilty of with regard to how close we are to doing new things in the relatively near future. So you mentioned the stem cell field as an example of the first of these. I think the tissue engineering field, as of maybe 20 years ago, 15 years ago, would be a great example of the second one, where the field thought that it was further along than it was, and a lot of people went to investors, and lots of companies were formed, and the science really wasn't there, and nearly all those companies collapsed, and lots of people lost money, and the field was really not, it really wasn't the best way for things to go. Of course, tissue engineering is now very much back on its feet, but it took a long time. I think the distinction here, really, where the rubber hits this road, is with regard to where the money is coming from. Because that scientific over-optimism that existed with regard to tissue engineering was kind of a copycat scenario with regard to what happened 20 years earlier than that in the cancer field, when people started saying, oh, we can make cancer a chronic disease, and politicians, especially in the US, started getting behind that, and we had the war on cancer, of course. Okay. Now, the huge difference is that in the case of the war on cancer, there was never a financial backlash, because the money came from the government, and once the public and the government got behind this, once they got the bit between their teeth, the fact that things ended up going much more slowly than people had said it would, it didn't matter. There was never a backlash where the NCI got a reduction in their funding or anything. So what this all tells me is that when it comes to public funding and government decision-making, we have to start by recognizing that ultimately elected representatives only want one thing, which is to get re-elected, and therefore we have to start by influencing public opinion first, and only by that means will we actually influence public policy. I think a lot of us spend, to be honest, a lot more of our time than we should trying to influence elected representatives and getting lots of, warm words and nice touchy-feely reactions from them, but not actually getting any policy changes, because at the end of the day, these people will only make policy changes if they see that there are votes in it.
That's, you're always the one that has to remind us of the rude realities. Lynne, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I want to come in on that very much. Aubrey's hit the nail on the head with influencing policymakers. One very promising thing in the UK is part of the government's election manifesto was a promise to increase healthy life expectancy by 5 years by the year 2035. And they needed a roadmap to do that. So I'm an advisor for an all-party parliamentary group on this for longevity. And we launched a report in February that set out particular ways that we can move towards it. And science was one of many different aspects. So there's tech, there's behavioral science, there's social science, finance, business, everything else involved in it. But there is more of a political will. And I think the political will comes from the financial argument that so many health systems around the world are just going to go bankrupt with the cost of looking after sick older people, and it's an awful lot cheaper and economically makes sense to keep people healthy for as long as possible, because not only are they not costing money in the care system, they're economically productive, they're spending their billions, trillions in the so-called silver tsunami economy. So what we need to do is actually make the financial argument, make the scientific argument, speak the right language to the right people. So the entrepreneurs, the techie people, they got it from the beginning because they're creative, innovative people. They can see the future, right? It's the more small c conservative organizations that you've got to convert. You've got to tell them the hardcore story, but from a very calm, slow, rational perspective. And I think one of the things that has been a bit difficult in the field is so many anecdotal stories, as Aubrey was saying, things that have been hyped that don't work. And what we need, and something that Marc was talking about, is clinical trials, proper placebo-controlled, double-blinded clinical trials for what works and what doesn't work. And we've seen this with COVID very recently. There's so much hype on things like hydroxychloroquine. We have no idea if it even doesn't harm, let alone whether it does any good. And we've got to be so careful to get past regulators, to get through the very cautious, risk-averse authorities, to get long-term government funding by doing it slowly and doing it properly and showing that this stuff really, really works. So I think we need different messages for different audiences. So governmental agencies, charity bodies, we have to be very calm, very rational. The tech people who are funding the longevity stuff, they get it already. They're already there. We don't need to convert that audience. But one of the things that I think we need to do is also retrain our clinicians. They are the people who are going to be giving medicines to older people. And I have annual meetings with clinical gerontologists just before they do their exams and give them some training courses. And they have aging as a tiny, tiny part of their course, if at all. And it's taught that there are different diseases of aging, that there's no process. No one knows that this stuff exists. So it's too late if we leave it to the clinicians. We've got to get in there and we've got to change the clinical training curriculum. We've got to actually produce a training program for current gerontologists and gerontologists, people who are dealing with older people here and now. So sorry, I've hogged the microphone.
Oh, no. So I basically totally agree with your points, but let me include another perspective, okay? I think what it's also missing, and I think we should push a lot on that, is how we engage more with traditional VCs and big pharma. Because obviously, any push, and I would like to see soon a big licensing deal between biotech on aging and a big pharma. I think that will also support a lot what is going on. Because, for example, when we started the company with Manuel Serrano, we started the company in Barcelona, and the traditional seed investors that I've been before being invested in other companies, they were not paying attention to this. They were saying, what is that? They didn't even get it. And it was so difficult for us to fundraise in seed in Spain. And then we have this special longevity investor coming from Boston and investing directly because they know about the science from Manuel. So I think that what we learn from there is that if we want to move with our programs, at some point we will need to convince not only the politicians and the public, but also the big pharma and the corporate venture funds from the big pharma, because they are the ones that they are going to carry on with these projects.
Couldn't agree more. I mean, that's the lifeblood of biotech, right?
Yeah.
I mean, Mike, can I just follow up on one of Marc's points? Sorry, butting in. Please. But I was at a meeting, small meeting on the future of pharma, and trying to get across the idea that traditional drug development is based on having a particular protein target that you can fit a drug in, and you completely inhibit the function of that protein. Now, for aging, it's much more complex. We need a systems biology approach, and you can't say that you have one protein target and one drug that's going to hit that. And so what you need is to redefine what we mean by a drug so that it can even go past the regulators, because regulators require a mechanism of action. They want target-based mechanism of action. And so if we actually redefine it and say maybe the senescent cell is a target, it doesn't actually matter whether your drug is pleiotropic. In fact, it might be good if your drug is pleiotropic and hitting multiple different parts within.
Here are those zombie cells.
Yeah,
exactly.
Taking your point, imagine I go to the innovation task force from the European Medical Agency, okay, with that, okay, and then it is not, but let's imagine that is the BCL inhibitor, okay? They will try always to ask to follow the track that you are developing a BCL inhibitor, as other pharma did in the past for oncology, okay? But maybe it is our case that we are developing a BCL inhibitor not for oncology and as an aging drug. So how we twist that, I think this is a clear challenge that we need to pursue, okay? Yeah. Yeah.
Well, listen, our time's about out here. I want to thank all of you for your advocacy for this field. My concern, I mean, I worry about the hype, but my biggest concern is there's this, millions of people out there in grave need of these technologies that we know could be applied in human medicine, and they just will not be developed in time for so many people for lack of belief, for lack of funding, from governments and from industry and venture capital and everything else. There's an old biblical maxim, I don't know if you've ever heard of it, my people die for a lack of a vision. And I think we tried to lay out a little bit of the vision of what we in the field of aging research could do. And I want to thank all of you for your tireless advocacy and your rigor, trying to get accurate, true science and medicine communicated to the public. So thanks for all of you for participating today.